future belongs to the curious. This is an act of discovery. Come and experience it with us in Arrowcat and discover your creative potential. This is your path. This is your journey. You decide how it's going to be. Time to free your curiosity that's always in you. Come and experience it with us in Arrowcat and discover your creative potential.
Hello, welcome everyone. Today we will be talking about Dr. Paul Reilly's latest book, which is published actually this year, called Digital Contention in a Divided Society. Before, of course, Dr. Paul Reilly will start with his presentation. Just want to say just a couple of, very few words about him. Dr. Paul Reilly is a senior lecturer in social media and digital society at the University of Sheffield. His research focuses on social media sus Williams. I always have problems. Sorry to spell this word. Digital activism and the use of digital media to promote better community relations in divided societies. He has written 2 books on the role of digital media and conflict transformation in Northern Ireland. The first one was published in 2011 called Framing the Troubles Online. And the latest one that we will be talking about today, published this year, called Digital Contention in a Divided Society. They both published with Manchester University Press. And his work has also been published in a number of journals, including First Monday, Information, Communication and Society, Journalism, New Media and Society, and Policy and Internet. Paul, welcome to Arrowcat. Even though it's a webinar, it's not, let's say, physically you're in academia, and hope that we will have you here when the pandemic situation will get better, hopefully. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Hakan, and thank you again for the invite. Hopefully we can do it in person again soon. I'd like to obviously start the presentation, so I'll have to say next slide here due to some technical issues. So thank you again for Cactus's support. So if we go to the first slide on ICTs as tools for facilitating intergroup contact. Essentially, my research, and Hakan has been very kind in summarizing it there, it's been over 10 years since my first book, looks very much at the notion of how ICTs can or cannot provide communicative spaces in which groups that do not share physical space, particularly in divided societies, can come together, and looking at particular whether online platforms, which are the focus of this book, can perhaps be a force for good, or as they often are, a force for bad. So if we can go to the next slide, please, I'll start the presentation. Thank you. I mean, just to give a broad overview of the literature, and I'm sure this will be familiar to some of you in this session today. I mean, we often have this idea of information communication technologies as liberators, as tools, suggesting they're neutral. And again, what the literature says, released since around 2006, looking back at Amichai, Hamburger, and McKenna's work on this, there was this notion perhaps that using digital technology would allow people to perhaps have a reduced anxiety around meeting members of other groups. So this obviously has enormous potential for peace building, that it would address a lack of neutral space where you could have this cross-community or cross-cultural interaction. And Amichai, Hamburger, and McKenna's model, you'll see a picture here, very much had an idea that this would be part of a gradual model building up towards face-to-face contact. So in divided societies, such as Northern Ireland, where my research focuses, this also would apply to Cyprus, for example, that you would effectively build towards richer forms of intergroup contact, perhaps starting at text only, where again, you'd have perhaps fewer of the interpersonal cues, which might make that intergroup contact more difficult and more difficult to sustain. Next slide, please. To give a little bit of a background on this, and I've presented on Northern Ireland for a good 15 years. It's very hard to get this into one slide, so you'll forgive me for being short on this, but Northern Ireland remains a deeply divided society over 20 years after the Good Friday Agreement. Clearly, the 1998 agreement was seen as a watershed moment in terms of the peace process, but the way in which peace was created was with a consociationalist power-sharing arrangement where effectively elites shared power. They led their ethno-sectarian blocs and also shared power within an executive within the Northern Ireland Assembly. But we have had since then really a continuation of political leaders who have used imagined hurts, have used discourses around the conflict itself, which often vilify the other community, that they have used that for electoral gain, continue to do so since 1998. Seen more recently in the discussions over Brexit, where there has been, again, a sectarian divide really around some unionist parties wanting a harder form of Brexit and other nationalist and Republican parties wanting to remain within the European Union. But we also have issues around segregation, which I think will be very familiar to many in the audience here in Cyprus, that we have peace walls. You'll see a picture on the slide here of one of the more famous ones or infamous ones at Cooper Way. We have 108. I think our figures went up since I did these slides. Peace walls still dividing Catholic and Protestant communities, particularly in parts of North and West Belfast. And perhaps the biggest issue, thinking about how to move forward from conflict, we are very much in conflict transformation here rather than the conflict being over, is that the DUP, the largest unionist party, and Sinn Féin, the largest nationalist or Republican party, have really failed to agree ways to deal with issues of conflict legacy, even insofar as not agreeing that what is a victim. There's a hierarchy of victimhood that still applies, and we've seen that play out over the last 23 years. So overall, it does suggest that Northern Ireland does remain very deeply divided, that there are still issues here, despite the fact that there has been some research saying that a certain proportion of this population do define themselves as Northern Irish, do actually reject the idea that there only could be British or Irish. There still seems to be this logjam, particularly in terms of dealing with conflict legacy. Next slide, please. So I'll jump into some of the things in the book. And to give a bit of context, I'm aware of time, so I'll not talk too long about the process. But this book was very much the difficult second album after my first book, which was based on my PhD. So my first book, which Hakan mentioned, Framing the Troubles Online, looked at websites and really how community groups, political parties framed the peace process. So again, how they used their websites, what functionality those websites had. And looking at my second book, where I wanted to follow this up and talk about online platforms, when this was contracted, I mean, there was very much in the book, I talk about some of the political parties had very negative views of social media. Didn't really think it would change very much had a view that it wouldn't change how they campaigned and it wouldn't really transform or affect community relations. But then in the process of writing the book, so after I conducted those interviews with political parties and some of their communication representatives, we have the flag protests. So we have in 2012, December 2012, a very contentious and controversial vote to change the flag protocol over Belfast City Hall. You'll see the picture on the right of the slide. We have, again, a campaign effectively of street protests, of disrupting arterial roads across the region by flag protesters. These are loyalists who obviously have an affinity to being British and to want to remain part of the UK. And they have also deep-seated grievances about the peace process. They see the peace process as having benefited the nationalists and Republicans and not them. So this becomes a lightning rod for issues around disillusion with the peace process. And we see for the first time Facebook, Twitter and YouTube being used around these protests. So you think of the time frame, we're in December 2012. So we are sort of just after the Occupy movement. We are, almost a year, 18 months after the so-called Arab Spring. We have some of the same kind of discourse around how online platforms were being used in relation to the flag protests. It's very much framed by the media. And in the book, I do some analysis of newspaper coverage as being fueled or powered by Facebook, which is perhaps a little bit simplistic and reductive. But what we find is there's public pages being used. This is obviously nearly a decade ago. So at the time, perhaps there was a certain degree of naivety about organizing protests on publicly accessible pages where people could troll and obviously be quite negative towards those organizing the protests. And this one, Loyalist Peaceful Protest Updater, again, some people would probably question the word peaceful here, because clearly there was some violence, particularly in East Belfast during some of these protests, particularly between December and March 2013. And what we found is that there was a lot of antagonistic interaction, sectarian comments, again, anti-Catholic comments being shared by some of the protest supporters, but also critics were using these pages to troll and to perhaps antagonize some of the protesters themselves. We also have misinformation. So, this is perhaps 4 years before social media and misinformation became trendy with Brexit and with Trump. But we have a one rumor which was spread, and again, I found evidence of this on the Facebook pages, about the Southern Irish Police, the An Garda Síochána, being drafted in to police the protests. Obviously, for loyalists who strongly identify as British and obviously are very anti-Irish in many ways, that was seen as very provocative. It wasn't true. And what happens is that something which starts with a text-only rumor shared on these Facebook pages gets to the point where the media obviously have to ask the then Justice Minister to comment on this. And of course, David Ford denies this and says it's not true. So we have this early evidence, perhaps, of misinformation being used or being spread rather on Facebook, and also some examples of disinformation, which I'm going to talk about in a second. Next slide, please. At the same time, we have social media being used, again, as part of counter publics to the flag protest movement. So we have on Twitter hashtags like Operation Sit-In. To give a bit of context, this was designed to support Belfast's bars and restaurants around the Christmas period in 2012. They were disrupted by the protests. They saw a massive downturn in their takings as a result of the disruption caused by the protest movement. And Operation Shutdown was one of the hashtags used by the protesters. So Operation Sit-In almost is a play on words of some of the tools used by the flag protesters themselves. We have the police service in Northern Ireland, for those of you unfamiliar with the acronym. They're criticised for not doing enough for effectively facilitating these street protests. There's a lot of debates about whether they should be removing the protesters and stopping them from blocking roads or not. This does end up in the courts. And the police eventually are found to not have implemented the law correctly, that they should have cleared some of those roads. But we also have parody groups, and you'll see the symbol on the right-hand side of the screen, Loyalists Against Democracy, a parody group of some of the loyalist flag protesters themselves. Their name taken from one of the banners that they had seen at some of the flag protests that they had witnessed. A lot of images of the flag protesters circulate on social media and online. And Loyalists Against Democracy really frame themselves as a group that want to shine a light on the sectarianism, some of the hate speech, which was being shared by some of the flag protesters on Facebook and other platforms. At the same time, there's a response to this, which suggests, well, is this helpful? If we think about negative stereotyping, about the contact hypothesis, which my research draws heavily on, clearly Loyalists Against Democracy, or LADFLEG as they later became known as, we're often ridiculing people's spelling and grammar. We're reinforcing stereotypes of working class people, working class loyalists. And there are people who suggest that perhaps they were doing more harm than good because they were actually further antagonizing those behind the protest movement itself. Next slide, please. We also see memes. This is a selection. There's a chapter in the book where I go into this in more detail. And again, there's a range of them that go from perhaps quite innocuous and perhaps quite irreverent humor, sort of silly citizenship as the theoretical framework that John Hartley talks about and I use in the book, engage with, but also those that perhaps are perhaps more stereotypical. So you'll see here, for those of you familiar with the US sitcom, The Big Bang Theory, we have fun with flags and the flag protesters behind, ridiculing, poking fun at their attachment to the Union flag. We also have the South Park meme on the right. So I think that's going more towards the end, where it's again suggesting that the loyalists were unintelligent, ill-educated, bigoted, again, portraying them in those ways too. And the Liam Neeson one, Taken 3, again, perhaps more on the side where it's not designed to offend, but clearly again suggesting that some of the loyalists were perhaps unhealthily attached to this flag, that this was an issue that perhaps didn't merit the widespread street protests and demonstrations seen between December 2012 and March 2013. Next slide, please. Related to that, and I think this does come back to how social media can perhaps amplify content which may seem to bring people together, perhaps against something. So there's the affective element of this, and I draw heavily on Papachirisi's work on affective publics in the book. There were a lot of people who were obviously quite annoyed by the disruption being caused by the flag protesters that felt it was unnecessary. And they do, as well as supporting Loyalists Against Democracy, they do use Twitter and this hashtag flags. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Belfast accent, it's a bit different than mine, but flag, it was sort of almost ridiculing how people who supported the flag protest movement said the word flag. And we see here a debate, and I think what was interesting here was within those using this hashtag, we have Northern Ireland Twitter. Again, I'm defining that quite broadly, but we have probably about 300 to 400 accounts in total who were tweeting heavily about this, political tweeters, talking about, well, is this actually helpful? And I think Liz Fawcett, who's a researcher, I think captured quite well my view on this based on the research that I did, that was, while it might not be designed to offend, it was certainly patronizing. This notion, again, that perhaps things that are uniting people, again, people united by emotion, by affect, perhaps might be seen by others as antagonistic, as perhaps, confrontational and adversarial. And I think that's something which, we do come across a lot when we look at how Twitter is used, particularly around political events. And I'm sure it's the same in Cyprus as well, that we do have Twitter used really as an outlet for people to give off, to vent. And perhaps that often takes forms which might actually deepen division, not solve it. Next slide, please. I did find some evidence of bot activity. Now, I think what's interesting here is I would not suggest that this was widespread, but I think it was interesting that in 2012, 2013, there was seemingly some evidence of bot activity. This is one account where it's referring to Stephen Nolan's television and radio programming. Stephen Nolan is, I think it would be fair to say, a shock jock. He has very adversarial debates on his TV and radio programming. And you have a hashtag there where the flag protests are effectively mediated online and via radio and TV every day during the flag protests. And this particular one, what's interesting here is obviously this is using Botometer. It is not flawless, but what was interesting here is when you look at the picture of this account, obviously there are multiple accounts that have that picture as well. And this particular tweet was being used extensively around February 2013. You'll note again, slowly losing hope for humanity, and a hashtag which I'll not use because we're at midday today. But we see here that, again, there's an element of coordination. But how effective it is, I think it's fair to say if this was, again, part of a Shinner bot or a Sinn Féin campaign to do this, it didn't seem to perhaps reach the levels that they may have anticipated. But it's interesting to think again about the time period. This is 2012, 2013, and we have some evidence perhaps of manipulation, of organized or coordinated activity to perhaps dominate hashtags which were discussing some of the issues around the flag protest itself. Next slide, please. My other case study in the book, which I think brings it on a few years, but there are a lot of similarities and crossover with this, is the Arddoyne parade dispute. Again, for those of you unfamiliar with the geography, the sectarian geography as it is often of areas like North Belfast, the Arddoyne parade dispute has been a deeply contested one for many years. Essentially, it's an Orange Order parade that goes past the Arddoyne district, a nationalist district of North Belfast. And there's frequently been trouble involving where the police, supporters of the Orange Order, the Orange Order parade, and residents accompanying these particular parades. And what I was interested in, really following on from the flag protest study, was, well, are there similar themes here in terms of misinformation or rumor, but also disinformation and efforts to antagonize and inflame community relations? So what I did was look at how Twitter was used around the Ardından parade in 2014 and 2015. And in 2014, it was following on from a year where there was violence. There was widespread violence and condemnation of that violence from political parties across the spectrum. So there was an expectation perhaps in 2014 that without a resolution on this parade, a peaceful resolution where both sides agreed to either facilitate it or not to, that there would be violence. And looking at how Twitter was being used, there were some things I found in both years which were quite fascinating. Firstly, that loyalist and Republican tweeters were checking what each other were saying. So there were, again, efforts perhaps to fact check in real time, but also to push back on narratives which one side felt were false or misrepresentative, but also images. And again, if the Facebook study that I started with looked very much at text, we have here a lot more visual mis and disinformation, for want of a better word. You'll notice the picture on the right-hand side of the slide, and this is one example, and there were several, that it appears a flag in the middle of it and an image. What you have here is a photojournalist fact-checking, effectively in real time, an image that was shared of a bonfire which allegedly had burnt a picture of Oscar Knox, a young child who had cancer and had been in the news, part of campaigns to raise funds for his treatment. And the visual disinformation in this case was that, again, just before the 12th of July parade in 2014, a tweet came out which said they're burning an image of Oscar Knox, a child with cancer. And obviously, trying to shame this particular bonfire and those who made it in Randallstown. And what we have here is, again, a photojournalist who had taken the image which had been doctored, saying, for those of you sharing this, take a look at this image. This is how it differs, and actually checking in real time within minutes, in most cases, that wasn't true. And we have this sort of effort to debunk particularly photoshopped images occurring in 2014, particularly when it appeared that those images were designed to inflame sectarian tensions around parades. And this often takes a few minutes. Next slide, please. This is probably the clearest example I have of this. And I think it works to several levels. You'll notice the parade on the left-hand side. This is one of the tweets, which again was obviously designed to antagonize relations. You'll notice the time, again, 7:30 p.m. on the 12th of July. So again, the 12th of July parade, the return parade is around that time. And you'll notice it's a very, very bad, crude effort at photoshopping. It's quite clear that the placard being held up, which appears to say no parade, no violence, and has, again, an anti-Orange Order placard being held up, is clearly false. And you'll see on the right-hand side of the screen, there were journalists who were present. Obviously, one of the things that's interesting about Ardından is that journalists often turn up expecting trouble. They're deployed to the scene. And if there's nothing happening, they're obviously taking pictures of what they're seeing. And in this case, this image, which was shared by another tweeter, again, you'll note the timestamps 7:30 and 7:40, is a tweet to the person who shared that doctored image saying, why did you Photoshop this and tell lies? And you'll note that the images of the placards are love thy neighbor, and they're basically Christian activists who are calling for peace. So a very noticeable difference. And what we see here is perhaps, again, within minutes, people actually taking the time to say that's not true and to push back on false narratives and visual disinformation as this appeared to be. And it's a very good example, again, about how I think in this case, if you looked at the image on the left, you'd probably presume it was doctored because it doesn't look a very good Photoshop. But perhaps that reflects the time. It was 2014. They're a lot more sophisticated now. Next slide, please. The other one I would draw attention to is there was an incident in the 2015 period where Phoebe Clausen, a teenage girl, was hit by a car driven by a member of the Orange Order, John Ockey. He drove his car into a crowd of Arddoyne residents who were obviously involved in a counter demonstration to the parade itself on the 12th of July, or the 13th of July as it was in 2015. And we see here an example of how loyalists immediately turn. You'll see the image on the right. Republicans have overturned a car at Arddoyne shop fronts. So again, the Arddoyne residents are attacking a car. And what actually had happened was that John Ockey had driven his car into a crowd of people who happened to be there. And the car had to be lifted physically off Phoebe Clausen, who suffered quite serious injuries. So we see here, again, look at the vantage point of the tweet on the right too. There, if you can see it clearly, they're actually across the road at a roundabout near the interface, which divides, again, Woodfield from Arddoyne. So again, a loyalist area from a nationalist or Republican one. And we see here that the tweet on the left also suggests the media are part of a conspiracy here, that they're not telling the full facts that the car, again, about what happened with the car. So we see here perhaps an element where social media is being used to circulate things which aren't true, and perhaps not knowingly untrue. Next slide, please. Overall, what I found in the book, and again, I think it's a reflection of the time period in which the data was collected and analysed, was that often this was very, crude, unsophisticated photoshopping. There, again, there was a lack of coordination. Perhaps if an effort was being made to generate antagonism, to inflame community relations in these divided areas, that it wasn't perhaps that effective, or it didn't appear to be. That it was often produced and shared by private citizens, who often perhaps got more fame or infamy perhaps through being debunked by others. And often when corrected, that content was effectively reinforcing existing views. So there was an element, if you're familiar with the literature on mis and disinformation, the idea of belief echoes, that even when corrected, people chose to believe the initial false allegation, the rumor, the disinformation, that it perhaps didn't change how some people felt about the parade itself. And there was that element of partisan selective sharing, where people were effectively sharing things with their own followers, their own network, that they perhaps knew to be untrue, and that fitted their narrative, their worldview on what was happening in Arddoyne. And I think that again reflects, there's a lot of literature since 2014-15 which really reflects this idea that it's not as simple perhaps as just fact-checking. That may not be enough to convince people, whether it's in Northern Ireland during a parade or whether it's about COVID-19 and vaccine safety. Next slide, please. There's a quote from the book. And again, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about since the book and since this research is, again, about indirect effects of online incivility. And I think, coming back to this notion again, that very often what we see in terms of the Facebook post, the tweet, the YouTube comments, these are all things I looked at in the book in great detail. Very often the people who are viewing and not commenting are what we don't really get the full picture of what they think. And what I concluded in the book was very much that indirect effects, negative stereotyping of loyalists by loyalists against democracy or the flag hashtag, certainly appeared to contradict one of the key tenets of reconciliation frameworks. Thinking of Hamber and Kelly's one, which I think is a very influential one, that dehumanizing groups, treating them as homogenous and anonymous as outgroups effectively, was not likely to improve community relations in areas such as Arddoyne or North Belfast. And what the extended or indirect contact hypothesis suggests is very much antagonistic interactions between Catholics and Protestants on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube and other platforms were perhaps likely to increase prejudice, not reduce it, towards outgroups, because they obviously fitted into a worldview held by both communities, to use that sort of crude analogy. So indirect effects might be perhaps more significant than direct ones. And we also have to think about how those who tweet, use Facebook and YouTube, are very often the minority, a minority within a minority. That a lot of people do not tweet about these events. But obviously the influence that people seeing what Arddoyne is trending for might be more significant. Next slide, please. Since Arddoyne and the flag protest, I think it's fair to say that silly citizenship, Hartley's idea about irreverence, about perhaps using humor in these ways, as perhaps came to the fore. I mean, here's some examples of it. Where, again, Loyalists Against Democracy were at the forefront here of campaigns drawing attention to now former First Minister Arlene Foster's involvement in a renewable heating incentive scandal. Again, vote to your boke. Again, the idea of trying to increase turnout at elections, trying to use humour as a way of doing that. And certainly we've seen that with Brexit. If we go to the next slide, please. I think this account, Border Irish, is a very good example of it. And I think it seems even more relevant today with what's happened since the UK has left the European Union. But we have this account, and you'll see here, that's me at the Brexit negotiations, the elephant in the room. Efforts here, perhaps by these Twitter accounts. There's one also for the Good Friday Agreement, where during the Brexit negotiations, they were obviously trying to provide some light relief from perhaps some of the more intense and antagonistic interactions on social media. And I think, again, it's interesting to look at this, that Border Irish got a certain degree of credibility, I think, by being retweeted by politicians, academics, and other powerful people. Next slide, please. Bringing up to date with April 2021, and this is something I'm working on at the minute. Again, we have false flag social media accounts calling people out, organizing violence. This is a message that was shared again on various platforms, from WhatsApp through to Facebook, and also it was shared on Twitter when people received it. Again, you'll note that some of the language in it, I mean, obviously the use of the Union flag emoji as well, designed to get people to come out and to engage in violence. And this did happen in April 2021, where there were the so-called Brexit riots in Northern Ireland, which were nominally about the Northern Ireland Protocol, but also about other issues as well. And we see here, again, and evidence, earn your strips instead of earn your stripes. Again, still parodying or mocking the grammar and spelling and education of some of the loyalists. And I think it's fair to say with this, this was very quickly debunked. I mean, this was something that was very quickly picked up on. And people who were, again, members of loyalist protest groups did say, please do not follow this message. But it does, again, show that there are efforts there to antagonize and to perhaps generate conflict. Next slide, please. So to conclude the presentation, I mean, I think it's fair to say that there's a certain degree of dysfunctionality in the political institutions in Northern Ireland. And this has contributed to, again, high levels of polarization, which were arguably there before, but also a democratic deficit. People have deteriorating trust and faith in politicians to resolve issues, whether it's about conflict legacy or about bigger issues, such as COVID-19. The mis and disinformation seemed very frequently spread around contentious events, but again, it didn't appear to be successful. Of course, that does require value judgment. We don't know what's going on private Facebook pages or WhatsApp groups, and also what people who do not comment and leave a trace of what they think are made of some of the examples I've shown in this presentation. But it seemed to be easily identified. That silly citizenship appears to certainly permeate contentious debates, whether it's from the flag protests in 2012 through to Brexit and more recent events. But what digital media appears to do is focus attention on strongly held views around conflict legacy. And it does appear to reinforce worldviews and perhaps those that are increasingly pessimistic towards the political process itself. I'll stop there. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Paul, for this very, informative and actually useful presentation. I don't know. Of course, your book is all about mostly, you focus on the Northern Irish case. But as you said, several times in divided societies like Cyprus, actually, we can really use, and I think not only, in Cyprus, but one of the, I think, biggest contribution of your book is that the way that you actually studied, analyzed, how social media actually can or, is used by, citizens, especially in the age of this digital world, is very much actually related with that. But before, actually, I have another question, but maybe before that, I just would like to ask, even though you mentioned in your book, but just to explore a bit, what do you think about this interaction in the sense that exactly because, you have loyalists and you have, unionists, and they are always, let's say, sort of, competing with each other just to prove. But on the other hand, isn't it a kind of problem, especially when we talk about, digital democracy, that those people who support one idea, usually they prefer to socialize among each other, and how usually they overcome, let's say, this problem that one way or another they engage in a kind of dialogue that maybe, later it will enable them to really start and talk and discuss issues. But how do you find that, especially maybe using the Northern Irish case as an example, how, first of all, digital media in a way, contribute to this? Or, as some critics argue, it actually, is not, because we are just living in our own bubbles and we are not actually communicating, but we are just hearing, the same kind of ideas all over again and again. Thanks.
Thanks, Hakan. That's a great question. I mean, I think my argument would be that if we think back to a time before online platforms, before digital technology, you had a media landscape where it was very easy to suppress dissent, where people did not talk across boundaries. And I think if this applies to Northern Ireland, if Israel, Palestine, Cyprus, I mean, there are lots of situations. We've got a lot of data on how governments, elites, again, political actors were able to control discourse to that extent. And I think I would argue, and I'd be interested to hear your view on this too, that we do have a situation where I think people having a voice is a good thing. I think there is an issue about where those voices being represented by politicians, by the media. I mean, clearly before social media, the argument would be that they weren't. And I think there is certainly potential. And I think you made a really important point there about being exposed. I think there is a degree of, again, accidental and incidental exposure to counter viewpoints on the same issues that is helpful. Because you're quite right. How would someone, whether it's Northern Ireland or Cyprus, know what the members of the other community think before they had the ability to access, whether it was Twitter or other things being shared? So people often, I think, I mean, Axel Bruns talks about online platforms of, collapse, they basically allow context collapse. They're engines of that. I think that's definitely true. It may well be a case, though, that we shouldn't expect miracles to happen as a result of being exposed to a contrary viewpoint. And the argument there might be that there's still a gap there in terms of what political leaders need to do to bring communities with them to actually seek out, common ground or to compromise. That requires political leadership and community leadership, which will not happen organically just because people can see what the other side are saying on Twitter or on Facebook. But my kind of overall view on it is that certainly during the Troubles, and for example, we had the BBC very often under political pressure not to even allow members of Sinn Féin to speak on TV. We had the broadcasting ban, we had efforts to censor. Now there could be no mistake that if you want to find out what someone who is a nationalist, Republican, unionist or loyalist, you can probably find that online. Now, it may not change your mind about what they think, and that's the caveat. I mean, it would be great if it did, but clearly you're being exposed in ways that you weren't, and you're more likely to learn about issues, perhaps issues that unite as well as divide, because you have that access. So I think overall it is a positive development, people having the platform potentially to speak. I don't think they're often listened to. And I suppose my concern about this would always be if politicians aren't responding and listening to what people are saying, whether it's online or offline, those people become more disillusioned with the process. And whether it's a peace process or a political process, they have no incentive to buy into it. And that's perhaps where you have populism and you have perhaps bigger societal issues around information crises and obviously democratic dysfunction. So yeah, I think that's a long-winded answer to your question, but I'll be interested to hear more about Cyprus as well in terms of whether platforms are having that effect or not, whether they are exposing people who were not exposed before.
Thank you very much. Actually, yes, I was just about actually to say this. But before that, actually, yes, I think one important element that you mentioned is here that social media, especially let's say with mainstream media, because it's very institutionalized, like, censorship and some other things, is possible, and people may not actually have even the possibility to see, let's say, or meet with the other, of course, even just ideas or even, as an image. Whereas in social media, it's true that there is this maybe slight possibility that may, completely open different paths. And as you said, of course, it needs encouragement or some political leadership. Regarding Cyprus, I think, I don't know what other my colleagues think, because I also wanted to bring out in relation with Cyprus. But I think in Cyprus, yes, we do have, of course, not exactly in the same way, but especially in the last couple of years, we have this issue. And I think the usage of Twitter, specifically when it comes to political issues or Facebook, became more and more, let's say, popular right after, Gezi Park protests in Turkey in 2013. If you remember that, in Turkey, there was this huge, protest that was actually nationwide, except one city in all around Turkey. And that contributed actually a lot. In Cyprus, though, lately we have a usage of this, but again, my impression is that the problem, especially here, is usually those who follow each other, they're just repeating, the same thing. And it's not very much like, dialogue. And that will actually help me to move on to my second question to you. Because in your case, I think one of the differences that I mentioned, a while ago regarding digital activism in Cyprus is that actually we have a language issue. Okay, I mean, let's say as a community, like Turkish Cypriot community, yes, we do have exactly like the same situation that you have in Northern Ireland, in the case that we use the same language. So when it comes to, let's say, Turkish Cypriot society, people, of course, discuss daily politics and something in relation with Cyprus issue or not, like domestic issues, whatever. But at the end of the day, people they use the same language and they interact with each other one way or another. Even, yes, I just said that it's a very slight, let's say, maybe communication. Whereas of course, again, this is just a question. What question and comment in a way. What do you think in Cyprus the situation would be, especially in a country that, we have two, let's say, major communities, and one speak, Greek and the other one speak in Turkish. And when it comes to issues, especially about Cyprus issue, or I may just give quickly, like, this COVID-19 situation. Of course, I don't know how you're familiar with the situation, but when the pandemic, when COVID-19 broke out in Cyprus, actually a week before, all of a sudden, Republic of Cyprus side, the southern part, the government unilaterally announced that they were going to close, 4 checkpoints without actually saying anything. Whereas all two airports and other checkpoints were open without having any health checks or whatever. And then, of course, when we had cases, it became a bigger problem. And then both sides, like one day later, they shut down checkpoints. That meant, like 3.5 months, there was almost no interaction, between the sides. And when it comes to, let's say, discussions about this issue, I can say that even though there were exactly like, different ideas and they were somehow, interacting with each other and everything. But on the other hand, in my case understanding, I think even though social media was extremely useful, especially to get the news and everything, but at the end of the day, I think it was also with the help of mainstream media, this issue really discussed in a much more, let's say, wider way. And I don't know, what do you think, when it comes to this? Because especially when you have a country that is, let's say, segregated by language. And because, I think your study is very useful and helpful about analyzing, these things. But I just would like to maybe hear comment or opinion about it. How do you think the same kind of study can be done in Cyprus when we have two different, let's say, two languages.
Thanks, Hakan. It's really interesting to hear that, actually. I mean, I'd imagine that it's adding complexity. I mean, I know that people would often talk about how platforms like Twitter will enable translation of tweets, and again, there are certainly been advances in that which are helpful. So people who are lay users of Twitter, for example, would be able to translate tweets they'd seen. So in terms of a language barrier from a literal sense, that's one way in which it could be circumvented. I do think it probably increases the chances of miscommunication and misunderstanding as well, by virtue of that fact that, particularly when you can't have the physical contact. I mean, I think the going back to Amichai, Hamburger, and McKenna, I mentioned in the first slide, I think the gap in that is very much that it assumes that text can't be misinterpreted. And when you have different languages, clearly it can. And clearly it often, I imagine, is. So I do think there's issues there about these platforms, while they are spaces in which things can collide that perhaps don't collide if there's no physical meeting. It also does increase the chances of things being misunderstood. And if they're about issues around conflict, then clearly that can be a very inflammatory situation. I mean, there's a related point that I think I also would sort of echo what you just said, that we're talking about Facebook, Twitter, and, again, platforms which are motivated by profit, that often amplify hate speech and things which, again, that travel the furthest are often the most antagonistic. Them having the power perhaps to facilitate this or not is also deeply problematic. And in terms of visibility, I imagine in Cyprus, as in other contexts, very often what people are seeing might not necessarily be a reflection of what the other community think. And I do think there are issues about platforms and regulation, but also the fact that we're using commercial platforms for this purpose. It would be far better if we were using non-commercial ones that did not have profit motivation, or an opaque algorithm system which seems to always amplify hate speech above all else. That's a big issue for me. One that I don't think we can solve, unfortunately. I mean, Christian Fuchs has written a lot about this, about the idea, could we have a public internet, and thinking of different ways. And I wish that we didn't have to rely on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube to have this sort of cross-community dialogue, because it is a bit troubling. It does give them a lot of power that maybe they shouldn't have.
Yes, I mean, especially, and I think this is also correct, please, if I am wrong. When I was reading your book, what I see that, you were really trying to really find a kind of, middle ground. Like, there is this, I mean, I don't know if, again, I'm correct to say that, but especially starting from 2010s, there were some kind of ideas when it comes to, digital activism and citizenship, and how these social platforms actually are useful or not. And I can say that, two camps, I call them like pessimist and optimist. Like pessimist, people like Micah White, who call this, he coined the term collectivism, and how actually it does nothing but just to satisfy, let's say, the companies. Whereas on the other hand, we have, optimists who think that technology will bring us freedom, which goes back to maybe a very an old argument. I'm not sure if I correctly spell his name, but Etiel de Solapoul, this American scholar, in 1982, when he wrote this book called Technologies of Freedom, he was like praising technology. And actually, it's like these technological determinist ideas. But what I see in your book is that you are really trying to find exactly like, this middle ground. And I don't know if, please again, correct me if I'm wrong or not, but I think, because by reading also Paulo Gerbaudo, you are also kind of, with the same line with him. He was also kind of, not always, also kind of, like balanced, starting from Twist and the Streets and the Mask and the Flag, and then, the Digital Party. Because I'm also, reader of his books as well, that I always try to understand. And I think this is much balanced in the sense that, realistic, I think, opinion, because as you said, at the end of the day, these are commercial. I mean, these are big corporations and they have their own interests. And if you just rely on, let's say, Twitter or Facebook, we can see that, I mean, especially scandals, Facebook scandals, proved all these things. So yes, I agree in that. There is one question, and I'm just going to read it. What if the misinformation surrounding past and present history relates to the cultural clash and hostility? There is a saying, how people ignoring their past are bound to repeat past mistakes. Will there ever be a resolution between two conflicting cultures when the issue of ownership, in the case of Cyprus, relates not to their clashing beliefs, but to their own beliefs?
That's a great question. No, thanks. I mean, just to pick up on what you were saying, Hakan, there, I mean, I agree. I think back to when I started teaching digital activism around 2006. Shows how old I am. But I mean, at that point, it was very optimistic. And I think there was a certain degree of hype, perhaps overhype, around 2011, 2012 with Occupy and the so-called Arab Spring that perhaps wasn't. And I think it's interesting, the literature seems to have moved more pessimistic. I think because we know more about how online platforms work. And I think your point about scandals is well made, that we now know more about what's under the bonnet with Facebook and Twitter and YouTube than we did in 2012, when perhaps we were more willing to buy into the idea that they were toppling authoritarian regimes and being used in very pro-democratic and optimistic ways. And I think my kind of viewpoint, a bit like yours, is probably it's become more pessimistic as we know more about how they do amplify things and not make other things visible. So I fully agree with that. And I think you're right in making the point that my book maybe argues that we probably can't get people to abandon these platforms immediately, and certainly not quickly. So we need to perhaps think from a peace building point of view, how do we try and leverage the same affordances of Facebook that are used to amplify hate and obviously to inflame division, to try and sort of counter those. And I think there are ways in which the book sort of says, well, maybe you can. The question's great because it does speak very much to this idea that if you have a contested history, and divided societies are often based on those, again, sincere fictions, whether it's real or not, within communities, online technologies amplify those same issues. They do not absolve them. They do not dissolve those divisions at all. And what you do find are that clearly people are more likely to buy into myths that are being spread online, which again reconfirm their worldview. And unless you perhaps try and find a way to move through that, and I think this is something that when we talk about conflict and peace building, all peace building has to be based around sort of those principles around trying to avoid dehumanizing the other, about trying to not to other rival communities, not to think of them as rivals at all, to have respectful difference around history is perhaps where you want to end up. And I think very often online platforms, because they're commercial, do not lend themselves to that. I think there's been some really good research about peace building projects where they obviously supervise the contact. So again, it's contact, but not without any kind of barrier. And I think there have been some very encouraging results where they have tried to have supervised contact using online technology and face-to-face, which does seem to break down barriers and reduce prejudice towards members of the other. And I think they're encouraging, but how do you scale that up? I'm not so sure. And obviously, if you're looking at how many people use Facebook, Twitter, YouTube still, despite the scandal, they're not going to go away anytime soon. So I do worry that they become almost another arena in which contentious histories are fought out, albeit online and not in person. And that obviously can be quite harmful, whether it's Cyprus or Northern Ireland. I think there's a commonality there. So it's a hard problem to solve, but it's a really important point. And thank you for the question.
Thank you very much. Maybe just again, I don't know if I talk too much, I'm sorry, because this, that subject's also always, make me, very enthusiastic, because I really like to think exactly, taking examples like, Northern Ireland and your case, and then, try to see in a different context, which is also related, with actually what you're talking about. But the thing is, we have some slight, let's say, differences. One example that just popped up to my mind was in Cyprus, I think it was like 7 or 8 years ago. I'm not sure if I'm correct about the time, but there was this kind of online platform called Mahalle. And what they were trying to do, they were trying to establish a kind of bicommunal, an online platform where, let's say, not just, business people, but also, youngsters, who would like to get in touch with, the other, some members of the other community and everything, that, they could have this space, which is very good. But exactly, again, it stacks, I think, again, the same place that was, of course, what I'm saying is not scientific, by the way, but because I haven't done any research, but, sometimes you can also, one way or another, at least, have some kind of observations. What I observed, I don't have the numbers yet with me, but people who use this platform were already actually like-minded people who were always, close to, seeing each other or, living with each other. Whereas those who were against, there were almost no way for them to convince to use that kind of platform. So at the end of the day, I can say that it's a failure because it doesn't exist anymore. So it didn't work. Exactly, as you said, even though social platforms give us this, opportunities, but again, especially in a situation like this, it always there is a kind of, I don't like to use that metaphor, but it's like there is this block, and it's like it's blocking there, and then it never moves on. And even though some people they come and they just in a way sometimes either hit it and just try to make it moves a bit, but once these, let's say, outside factors go, it doesn't work at all. So can we say that, or this is a bit sort of different case if we talk about the Northern Irish case, about political issues, especially like Protestants and Catholics, because we know that there are also, even though it's another debate, but there are some integrated schools and everything, whereas in our case there is not, because we have a complete segregation. What do you think this can, let's say, if it is related with your case?
I think that's a really good point. I mean, I kind of think it raised the same questions that a lot of peace building and ICT projects have, and it's a problem which I don't think they can solve, which is, who are your participants? And very often the people who are participating, whether it's e-democracy projects back in the 90s or peace building projects involving ICTs today, very often the people who sign up are those who are probably already minded towards participating in a peace building project. So arguably you're not reaching the people you want to influence or to bring along. And again, they're often the people whose voices are excluded from those supervised projects. So it's a big issue about representativeness. I think one of the things which perhaps sounds to me as if there's commonality, actually. When I think of, in the book, I talk about who was tweeting. I try and categorize who was there. I mean, a lot of the same voices are dominating, whether it's about Ardından or about the flag protests. It is the same people talking to each other, whether that's people within their own community or the other side. So again, there's an issue there about still a representative gap, where a lot of the people that you might want to bring along with you aren't going to be there online, whether it's an access issue. I think that's less of a problem now because, again, we're not talking about no one having internet access to the same degree that there were 20 years ago. Again, 80% would have some form of internet access, but whether they're accessing the Twitter hashtag, the online project for peace building, they're probably not. They're probably using these platforms for other things which are non-political, so you're not going to get them involved. And I do wonder, again, about segregation and about education. Integrated education in Northern Ireland is still a very small part of it. So we still have an issue there about perhaps the real heavy lifting for contact hypothesis, for actually trying to foster prejudice reduction against outgroups and also to encourage cross-community interaction. That's where you need to start. And I think a lot of politicians, there's a great comment I should point out from Kadas. Can we say that misinformation is a kind of survival guide to hold the power at all? I think misinformation often comes from the top. And I think we have to always be aware that it's very easy to buy into the narrative that misinformation is Russian trolls or people who want to cause harm. Governments are very much responsible for misinformation. Look at COVID, for example. I do think there are issues here about perhaps we have that gap to fix. And very often those in political power will often push technology as a way to resolve deep-seated societal issues, which require a lot more money and a lot more policy from them and a lot more leadership. And I think I'd be wary of some of the literature in ICTs and peace building, which tends to over-exaggerate perhaps how positive it is for people to use online tech without looking at the facts that if they're not being schooled together and sharing other aspects together, then they're not going to really bridge that divide at all. And it sounds to me as if that's something which does apply Cyprus, Northern Ireland, and else, lots of other places where that's not really being addressed.
Thank you. Another question asked by another colleague, Çağdaş. The question is, I'm just reading, do social networks have the potential to change civic engagement by influencing individuals towards a particular way of thinking through algorithms, essentially hijacking democracy?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think the short answer is probably they do have that influence now. I think the literature seems to certainly suggest, I mean, there is generally a positive link between people who use social media platforms to look for political information and their likelihood of participating. So we have that in the background. A lot of that research is the US based, but I do think there's a serious issue about how platforms' ability to make things visible or not visible can often pollute public discourse. And if you're in a society which is divided or a conflict and conflict transformation, for want of a better phrase, clearly that does have a particular negative influence. It's like they're putting their hand on the till. And I do think there's issues there about how platform regulation tends to focus more on issues which get a lot of media coverage. So again, about hate speech, about racism, but there's also issues here about perhaps that they are making some voices less visible than others. And clearly in a conflict transformation context, that could be very dangerous. So yeah, I think there is an issue about visibility, and there is an issue about, I'm sure you have this in Cyprus, you have people on platforms like Twitter who become commentators when they don't have an elected basis to be so. And they get a lot of influence very often by saying those antagonistic, inflaming things to get attention. So it almost becomes an area where those voices get amplified to the point where they get media coverage, and those in grassroots groups don't get that. And I think that's something which is problematic, very problematic, and something which does raise questions again about, if we can't trust platforms to regulate themselves, what we need to think about is how they're treated like publishers and they're held accountable for what they publish and what they do with their algorithms.
Oh, sorry. There was a problem with the mic, sorry. So yes, it's like, so when we think, maybe again, just to, compare, since we are in Cyprus, and try to actually, if I may allow to say that we're just actually, at least me, we're trying to take advantage of actually, your book and, your research and relate it, with our case. So at the end of the day, as you also shown in your research, the potential is there, and maybe I don't know if it's the correct word of saying, and maybe we should invest and see the potential without forgetting the fact that, exactly as you mentioned, all the other problems, like these are big corporations, and they have their own interest and everything. And now, especially since democracy is one way or another, of course, changing, and with the new measures, we can say that since people, interestingly, are dependent on more and more to social media or digital platforms, I may say, especially with COVID-19 case, since we had lockdowns and we had to actually stay in our private spaces and we couldn't go out. So actually, the only way for us to really see whether criticizing or not, we're all based on media. So either mainstream media or social media. My last question would be, I don't know if it's a good question though, because I was trying to formulate, but somehow I couldn't make it a good question. Especially after this COVID-19 situation and considering your research, do you think that there is a kind of rise in mainstream media, let's say vis-a-vis or, in compared with social media when it comes to, again, democracy and, political engagement, and even we may put it a bit further, activism? What do you think? I mean, the relationship between social media and digital media.
I mean, I think often it's sort of presented as a binary. So people talk about social media would be the end of mainstream media, and it clearly hasn't been. And I think very often, I'm sure you find this in your research too, the key gatekeepers of how information is created online on Twitter are still journalists and mainstream media. So I think mainstream media certainly will retain an influential position within this. And I think we often have to be realistic and thinking of, well, whose voices are amplified the most on online platforms? It's still, to a certain extent, elite ones. I mean, I still think we're not in a position to suggest that the hype of 10 years ago in 2011, which was this would topple authoritarian regimes or it would rebalance power relations, it hasn't really done that. I mean, I think you made a really good point earlier on about optimism and pessimism, and there's almost a middle ground. I think that's probably where I would still place myself, but I'm probably more negative because of what we keep finding out about how those platforms work. I do sort of wonder, citizens still have the ability to leverage online platforms for social good. I mean, I think we see that with the COP in Glasgow at the minute. I mean, online platforms are being used by groups who are not at the table talking about this, but to good effect. There's still a benefit of using online platforms to organize protests that was not there when we didn't have online platforms. And whatever way we look at it, the ability to connect with others where you're not in the same geographical location is a benefit to those who don't have power. It's just, I still have a degree of skepticism about whether it does transform things in the way that those technology companies want us to believe. And I think if Facebook, I mean, YouTube's slogan was broadcast yourself. You sort of think, well, if you are a person who's a YouTube account, you're probably not reaching a lot of people unless you've got a very extensive offline social network. People don't really cut through those barriers to the same degree. So I probably am skeptical about whether online platforms have transformed in the way that they were being claimed a decade ago. But I do also acknowledge they can be hacked and perhaps used in ways which help non-elites challenge elites in ways they couldn't when we only had mainstream media. So yeah, I'm probably skeptical at the minute, but ask me again in a year's time, it might be different.
Thank you very much. Maybe just to, before concluding, the session, again, it reminded me, this manifesto. I'm, if I'm not, wrong, it's like the public service media and public service internet manifesto, coined by different academics, and as you mentioned, Christian Fuchs. Maybe yes, this is one of the ways, but again, if I have the right to put my own personal view, I'm not very optimistic about it, to be honest. But of course, this is a great opportunity and something that really we need to work on. But I'm not sure, in the at least short term, what will bring, I don't know, but maybe in the long run, it will. Thank you very much again, Paul, for accepting our invitation and being here, even though, yes, not physically, but as I said, hopefully we will have you, in Cyprus soon for another occasion, or maybe we will have the chance to discuss actually a comparative, analysis between Cyprus and Northern Ireland in different ways. would you like to say something like as a kind of wrapping up, or?
Thanks, Hakan. No, I mean, thank you for the invite. It's been great. Some really interesting questions too. And definitely, yeah, we should talk about some comparative work, because I think there's a gap there in terms of critical ICTs and peace building and thinking more about how platforms are being used that we could definitely work on. So yeah, let's keep talking, and I'm happy to take an invite to Cyprus anytime when it's safe. That would be great.
Okay, thank you very much again. And thank you also very much for everyone who was listening and watching the webinar. And hope to see you here again. And have a good day. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Do you remember how you discovered the world around you? Can you hear the beat of life? Can you hear it by seeing it and feeling with all your senses? Hey, can you still hear it? There's something in you, driving you, calling you. Calling you in closer and closer. It's happening right now. Time to free your curiosity that's always in you. Now it's time to act. This is an act of discovery. It requires looking into the world in new ways. Much to answer for, but we're not offering you the answers. We are here to encourage your questions, but more important than the question is how you answer it. Try the ordinary, then try the unusual. To live is learn, and to learn is to live. Live, learn. It's an endless process. This is your path. This is your journey. You decide how it's going to be. Just enjoy every moment of it. We believe in design, keeping it simple but also significant. We believe in art for looking at the world with a unique perspective. We believe in creativity for communicating better with the world. Creativity takes courage. The future belongs to the curious. Come and experience it with us in Aracad and discover your creative potential.